All right, well, thank you for joining me for, oh, I have the wrong event. You can tell I reused the slide. This is from the virtual marathon. Whoops. Okay, this is an exam prep session for MS600. My name is Becky Bertram. I own Savvy Technical Solutions, which is based in O'Fallon, Illinois, just on the other side of the river in St. Louis. I've been a SharePoint and Office Apps and Services MVP for 11 years. I'm not technically a Microsoft certified trainer because I don't always use the Microsoft certified curriculum. So they booted me out of the program, but I can reactivate it anytime. So I am an MCT, just not in current standing. But I've passed 26 Microsoft exam over 20 years. So I'm sort of a professional exam taker, but I actually have written a lot of Microsoft exams and measure up exams and done exam prep training. So that's a lot of what I do. I am married for 13 years with 3 kids aged 9 and under. So I am busy. All right, so this is sort of going to be a packed session. The purpose for this session is to give an overview of the MS600 certification path, the objectives of the exam, and we'll go over a few practice questions. Clearly, it's not possible to prepare for the entire exam during this time. And so really, this is just a look at the types of topics that are going to be covered in the exam. First, we're going to talk about the certification path. As you guys probably know, the Microsoft recently redid the certification so that the certification process is now, they call it role-based certification. And so what that means is that whatever role you have, there are exams for that. In some cases, you have to have multiple exams to get a certification. That's always been the case. But in this case, there's sort of a one-to-one process. If you pass exam MS600, which is Building Applications and Solutions with Microsoft 365 Core Services, you will get the certification of Microsoft 365 Certified Developer Associate. So you pass one exam, you get a certification. Ta-da! Now, the thing I want you to point out, though, is that most people, most of the Microsoft 365 exams will prepare you for this certification path for the expert, the enterprise administrator expert. So for that exam, you have to pass exam 101, MS 101 and 102, pardon me, and an exam for your expertise, whether it's Exchange or Teams or whatever. Pardon me. That all being said, this is a developer exam, so this will not help prepare you to be an administrator. So passing this exam will not contribute towards getting your expert certification. So I just put it out there because there's a lot you can do, and there's a whole lot being made of the expert certification. For whatever reason, being a developer, you don't get to be an expert. You just get to have that associate certification. So I want to walk through a little bit of the process of what it takes, how exams are generated. And this is just helpful in general, I find, because it's going to apply to every Microsoft exam you take. Essentially, this is all outsourced, and I've been part of various parts of this process. They have several vendors out there that they'll talk with a vendor and say, we want to write an exam. The vendor will go out and find a bunch of experts, get together, and they hash out what the objectives for the exam are. If you want to know the Power Platform, what do you need to know? If you need to know AI, what do you need to know? If you need to know Microsoft 365, what do you need to know? Once they come up with those objectives, they hire one group of people and say, go write the exam. They hire another group of people to say, go write the practice exam. Another set of people will go write the book, and another set of people will write the Microsoft official curriculum. None of the other people for the practice test, exam prep book, or the curriculum have access to the actual exam. They are all writing off of the objectives. And so it's because they want to teach to the topics and not to the exam. However, what this means is when you're writing exam questions, I will give you a hint. Each exam question you write has to map to an objective. And so the reason I'm saying this is when you pull up those exam objectives, they are going to each map to, that is really what you need to study. And back in the day, the phrasing used to say, it will test anything, including this, but not limited to this. So they always leave themselves some leeway, but really, when you're writing exam questions, you have to say it maps to objective this, this, and this. So that being said, this really is the best way study. So even there are, I like reading books. That's the way I learn best. But I also have built a web page out there for years for exams, and I will just go through each bullet and literally will pull up docs.microsoft.com. Back in the day it was MSDN, TechNet, now it's all docs. But the point is you really can study off of docs because again, when people are writing the exams, they really are pulling their exams from, like they also have to put supporting evidence and they don't want it some guy's blog. So really it has to map to the objective and it has to be sort of Microsoft official documentation. And now sometimes it is blog entries from like someone from Microsoft or something. But my point is if you want to study, you don't have to pay for curriculum. Really, you can go on your own. And so the way I do it often is I just walk through and I actually, I will sort of like pick a bullet point for the day and I will go read it because reading the dictionary, it's kind of like that. It's not always fun, but it kind of helps you do it every day. And I find that when I learn a little bit every day, I've learned something new by the time I'm done, but I'm not trying to like process it all at once. All right, so let's also talk about question types. So when we go through the question types here, you can see that it's not just multiple choice. And so hopefully whoever's here has probably taken Microsoft exam before, but just understand that it's not just multiple choice or answer to, there are many different kinds of questions. And Microsoft does this because they're trying to avoid people cheating, quite frankly. Because for instance, when we're writing the exam, I will tell you that after you go through and you spend 3 days scrubbing the exam questions and making them perfect, what you actually do on the 4th day is you go through and you write, sorry, I'm gonna, there's a little bit of background noise, okay. When you go through, we actually will write an inverted version of the question. So the question is, what 2 buttons do you, what 2 things do you need to do? The inverted question be, what 3 things should you not do, or whatever. And so that's so that if people are doing exam dumps, they can't just memorize it and move on. There's a lot of randomization that goes on. So anyhow, just be prepared for some very creative question types. The next thing I want to point out is for case studies, just a hint, is that when I'm doing a case study question, when a case study is written, what they'll do is the exam writers will have to write like maybe 12 or 15 questions for that case study. So for every question that's being written, they have to have information about the question in the case study. So if the question says, what should you do to meet the requirements for the business team, the business requirements, well, there has to be a section in the case study that explains what the business requirements are, right? Well, when you take an exam, what they do is they actually randomly pick maybe 4 or 5 questions out of that bucket of 15 questions. So what this means is when you're reading through the case study, 3/4, 2/3 of the information in the case study actually is totally irrelevant to you because it's helping you answer questions that don't show up on your case study. So what I do is, to me, it takes a lot of time to absorb all that information. So what I do is I go through and I read the questions first, and then I go back and read the case study. And that way your ears are perked up for which parts of the case study matter to you and which parts can you sort of discard. So anyhow, that's sort of a test taking tip I'll put out there that makes it a little bit easier to kind of know what questions should be, what to focus on when you're doing that case study. All right, so let's walk through the objectives. There are 5 objectives, and you can see that there's a percentage next to them. That has to do with how they are weighted. Keep in mind, because there are complex question types, sometimes one question may be worth more than 1 point. If you have a build list where it says list the 3 things in order that you have to do, you may get 1 point for each correct question, but if there are 3 items in the list, that may end up being 3 points. So the questions have various weighting, but then the objectives themselves have weighting. The big thing that I will just point out is that teams in Office collectively account for 30 to 40 exams. So oftentimes when studying for them, those are sort of, they're weighted individually a little bit less, but together they're sort of on par with what the others are. But again, these percentages are very much in the same ballpark. So just go ahead and study all of them. So during the session today, I'm going to be walking through each of these various objectives and what they're covering. So the first objective is implementing Microsoft Identity. So let's walk through these. I don't necessarily want to just go ahead and read the slide here, but let's take a look. So there's registering the application, implementing authentication, configuring permissions to consume an API, implement authorization to consume an API, implement authorization in an API, and create a service to access Microsoft Graph. So for this main objective, we've got 6 sort of sub-objectives, and then each of them have bullet points underneath it. The main thing here is when you're studying it really is just to be aware of Azure Active Directory. And this really has very little to do with, there is some coding that you need to be aware of in terms of, if you notice the bullet points about the API, but a whole lot of it has to do with how are you registering apps, how are you using the API, registering a new API and consuming it. So it could be that your code needs to be registered so that other people can consume your code, or it may be that your code needs to access API, maybe such as the Graph API. So just be very clear on how that whole process works. So let's walk through the authentication basics here. First of all, it used to be, there's different terminology for it. It was sort of Azure Active Directory authentication. Now it's just called the Microsoft Identity Platform. And keep in mind that there's both authentication and authorization, and those are 2 different things. Authentication says, is this person who they say they are? And then authorization says, now that I know who they are, what do they have access to? Now, a lot of this is surrounding OAuth, and so you need to be very clear on how those identity tokens are called and refresh. I'll be honest, this stuff makes my eyes glaze over. Tokens have always confused me because there's a lot of, it gets passed here and packs back and encrypted and re-encrypted, and if you go through that whole process manually, it's really crazy making. But the great thing is the APIs sort of hide that for you. They obscure it for you. So you really just have to be able to call a basic method that says refresh the token, and it goes through all the process to do that for you. So you don't necessarily have to know at a deep level, like how do I decrypt tokens and things like that. You really just need to know which API calls need to make. The big thing for passing this really important to know is this chart right here. There are a lot of questions on these different flows. Yes, I love the fact that they use the word flow, which is not a word that's been reused a million different ways within the Microsoft ecosystem. But what they're talking about flow here is a matter of what scenario. It's really a scenario. They do a flow because it has to do with how those tokens go back and forth. So for example, an authorization code, again, is sort of that one-time access scenario. We've got implicit flow. and we've got refresh token, redemption, hybrid, OIDC flow, on behalf of flow, and client credentials. Really, the scenarios we're talking about, is it a single page app where you don't want to be redirecting them back and forth? Is this like a mobile app that people are using a mobile app to authenticate with? Or is this like a daemon app where you want to pre-authorize it, basically? So really, there's different terms for what flow it's called, but for each of those, you need to know what the flow is and sort of the scenario in terms of how you can do API calls, and how are you going to do authentication within Azure AD to set up that app registration. The next thing you need to know is the configuration elements. And this is also an important thing that will be covered on the exam. The important thing to know is that you've got sort of three scenarios. One, Azure AD is just, it's all in the family. You're building an app for your organization, and people will be authenticating using run-of-the-mill Azure AD credentials. The next scenario is B2B. So this is when you are setting up a trust relationship where people can authenticate using their own Office 365 credentials within your tenant. And then the last scenario is B2C, which means people can access your application and your tenant using Microsoft consumer accounts. You need to understand whether people are just trying to authenticate or if they are doing that double hop. So back in the days of Kerberos, Kerberos got over that, what we call double hop issue, right? Where you have to pass credentials along. That issue sort of still applies here in the sense that not only do people have to get authorized to get to your app, but if you need to basically be able to have them pass their credentials on to the next API you're calling, you need to know how that's going to happen. Like I mentioned before, we have those flows that we mentioned, but in this case, we've also got the scenarios. And so those flows really map to scenarios. A single page app is really used if you're building, for instance, a tab in a team. So within a team, you don't really have a back and forth button. And so you want to be able to build a single page app so that people can navigate around within that one screen. Web apps are just sort of your generic web application, maybe ASP.NET or open source, but it's sort of that basic web app scenario. Web APIs, or back in the day, we called them like web services. These are things where people are making sort of a REST call to your application. So how are they going to authenticate with that? Or even if there's not a user interface associated with it. Mobile apps and native apps are kind of the same thing, right? A mobile app is sort of responsive, it's like a web app, but the native apps are like using iOS, Android, that kind of thing. A daemon app is really a background process that's running. And again, that's something where obviously an inanimate process cannot click a I authorize button. So it's sort of a scenario where it's pre-authorized to run. And then finally, server-side apps. Again, these are apps, again, old school apps where they're running in that server process. Or maybe like Windows apps. So let me click on the link to kind of show you some of that documentation here. Oh, that's not good here. So the good thing is for the documentation, it really walks you through all the different scenarios with this, little diagrams here. So I would study this a lot because really when it comes to the exam, you basically have the scenario, the flow, the grant, whether it's B2C, B2B, etc., and then what's the scenario here that it's applying to in the documentation. So you just have to be clear of it's like having 4 different pieces that can be arranged in 4 different ways, right? So it's sort of exponential, but that is really the best way to prepare. All right, so when we talk about OAuth flows, like I mentioned, there's the implicit grant flow, and this is for the scenario. The flow is implicit grant. The scenario is a single page application. The authorization flow is mostly commonly used with single page apps, web apps, and native apps. The on behalf of flow is really when you're trying to do that double hop, when you're trying to pass credentials from one API to another. And that's, you know, in a web app, we will call that impersonation. It's not really impersonation. You're not impersonating someone else. They're still authenticating as themselves, but you're granting them permission to access that backend API. Client credentials, again, are used where you have service accounts, daemon apps, and then the device authorization is like Internet of Things. So if you've ever like tried to register, like when I signed up for Hulu, it's really hard to type on the TV keyboard, right? So it says we will send a, you know, the TV will show a code and it says go to your phone and type the code into the app. So that's that device authorization kind of thing, is you're basically saying, you know, here's a code, we're authorizing an app, and that's when it's not so easy to have like a whole keyboard there. All right, so next let's talk about MSAL.net and MSAL.js prompts. It's important when you're reviewing the API for this exam that you need to know basically both .net and JS. Now, again, in these scenarios, you don't have to memorize the whole API. It's just really the APIs that have to do with specifically the authorization here that we're talking about. The important thing here is just to note that when you first are trying to get that token, you're going to have, when they first log in, it has to be interactive. Basically, that's when the user is saying, do you want to log in? And they click the I want to log in. I authorize this. This is when they're actually, the user is doing something. But we know how annoying it is when people keep getting, you know, authentication prompts all the time. And so what it does is when that token's about to expire, it basically goes back and it says, you know what, if it's still in the token cache, grab it silently and you're not going to bother them with a prompt. So this is a way of not prompting users repeatedly. So what you're going to do in your code is you're first going to try and get it silently, and then if it has indeed expired, go prompt. But that's the order of events. You always want to do silent first and then interactive next. If you're doing MSAL.js, then you have two choices for that interactive option. If you're in a single page app, you don't want to redirect them because, again, if they get stranded, there's no back button. So if you've ever tried to log in with Microsoft Prompt, you know that there's a little pop-up button, you know, pop-up box. So the pop-up will float on top of the screen, and this is good if you don't want to have to worry about people getting stranded because they're in a single page app. But if you're not in a single page app, you're probably going to redirect them to the login page. If there's a problem, they can always just go back and start the process over. So again, for the exam, be clear between acquire token interactive and .NET and when to use acquire token pop-up or acquire token redirect in the JS. Scopes and API permissions, again, it's important to be able to understand how those scopes and permissions work. And understand too that there's scenarios where users can authorize themselves, but if you are an admin in your tenant, you can actually proactively authorize people for everybody in your tenant when you authorize an app for the first time, or you can ahead of time go into Azure AD and actually register it manually ahead of time and then pre-authorize everybody. And so a scope is basically a way of allowing people to authorize apps and sort of describing for them what this scope does. And especially if you're calling back in APIs, you need to be able to communicate to people effectively what are they actually giving permission to do. All right, let's move on to our next objective, building apps with the Microsoft Graph. Really, again, this is really learning APIs. It's the same way as if you're learning PowerShell commands or any API. There's really not any way through it, but through it, you really just have to kind of memorize it. However, that being said, it follows ODATA conventions. So if you're familiar with ODATA, this will seem very familiar to you. The other thing is that the Graph API is really, really big because it encapsulates the APIs for every single product that is part of Microsoft 365. That would be too much to quiz for this exam. So again, getting back to what I mentioned at the beginning in terms of objectives, you just really want to make sure that you're only worrying about the objectives that are talked about for this exam. And those objectives specifically do have to do with a lot about dealing with groups and group membership and Office 365 groups. So those are really the things you want to focus on. It really, again, that objective maps to really managing people and groups. There's some doing with OneDrive and SharePoint a little bit, but again, don't feel like you have to memorize the entire Graph API. I would just focus on users and groups mainly, and some of sort of basic things like get emails, get files, upload files, etc. Again, going through all the different objectives here. So if we look at the objectives, so optimize data usage. So you know how to use filter, select, order by, skip, and especially doing bulk operations. So that would be optimize network traffic and being able to do that batch operation. Again, from Microsoft Graph, accessing user information, files, and group life cycles. So again, those are the three things you're going to focus on: files, people, and group life cycle. I didn't feel like there was a whole lot in terms of emails, exchange, calendar, stuff like that. There's some, but again, this is just focused on what's in the objectives. So your biggest friend with this is going to be the Graph Explorer. And hopefully you have seen the Graph Explorer before, but this really gives you an interactive user interface, and it actually has great tools on the side. If you look at the carrots here in the screenshot on the side, it will show you sample calls that you can use for Excel, extensions, insights, applications, etc. So it will walk you through that. So again, I would focus on, SharePoint, OneDrive, users groups, etc. The great thing about it too is you can see, if you look in the screenshot, it says sample queries. You can go through and under authentication, it's going to give you sample data from a sample tenant, even if you're not logged in, if you want to get results back, just to see what those sample results are. But the great thing is you can actually authenticate with your actual tenant credentials, and then you will get real results back. So especially in studying for the test, for instance, if there's like update operations, and you want to be able to do an update and then see what it's like after the update, go ahead and use your dev tenant and try some of these operations and see if you can actually get these things to happen for these like post operations or patch operations that aren't just Git, and be able to see how that works. But this is going to be your best tool for studying. So when we deal with ODATA queries, you can filter results, select, order by, top, skip, expand, and search. Because of time, I'm not going to walk through each of these, but just understand these are ways of being able to limit what your results come back, especially expand. So I do want to talk about that. If you're dealing with relational databases and you know how to do like a join, if you have like a one-to-many relationship, there are many times when you're dealing with the graph that you may want to basically get a nested result set back. So for instance, if I say get user, get the user Becky Bertram, but then I also want to get all the files in Becky's OneDrive, the operation is a get user operation. But then if I say get her files, then that's sort of that, it's a related data, right? And so there are times where you can use that expand operation to be able to retrieve sort of that second layer of information, especially if it's like one-to-many. Now, it's really at the discretion of the API builders when that expand actually does anything. because you're telling it to go get other data, but the API builders decide whether it's going to return anything or not. So on an API by API basis, you really need to know when that expand is going to work or not. But that is a way to be able to get that sort of related data. Same with search. In some cases, so if you're searching for emails, you can pass in a search operation, and it's like doing a search in Outlook. But in other cases, you can do a search, and if the API builders have not built any capacity for searching into their API, this won't get you very far. So that expand and search, you really need to know kind of in what scenarios to use those. The next thing is optimizing traffic with batch requests. So there is an example of this in the graph Explorer, and so I would just really use that. I believe that there's a way to do this. But essentially what you're doing is instead of doing one get or post operation, you're basically doing them all together. And just like back in the day when we did, you know, active server pages and you had to post the whole page back and forth, it takes time to do multiple round trips. And if you know that you need to do a whole bunch of things at once, instead of getting a send, receive, send, receive, send, receive, back and forth, you can do them all at once. And the key here is just to understand that you can have sort of an order of operations. So if you look at here, there's an ID, ID1 and ID2, and then you can actually put that depends on. So that actually will say execute item 2 after item 1 has completed. So you're sending the instructions over in a batch, but that doesn't mean that they're going to happen willy-nilly, because you can't get to the information about the folder you're creating until you've created it first, if we look at what this operation is doing. So this is something that is covered in the exam. It's pretty straightforward, but just make sure you've digested that. The next thing is large file upload. And this is the case that typically when you add a file to SharePoint or to OneDrive, essentially it's just going to send all your bytes there. The binary data gets added there and that's done. But there are times where that could be interrupted. So say you want to upload a video or something that again is a large file, you're actually going to chunk it up there. And essentially what the process does is you basically do a first operation that's a post operation, and you call create upload session. You're saying, I want to upload a big file. What it's going to give you back is if you look in this response that it sends back, it's going to say this is the URL of where you're going to upload the file. So essentially gives you a temp location. After that, it's up to you to chunk it out yourself. And what you're going to do is you're going to chunk the file, pass them up to that location. And after each chunk that you send over, you're going to get a response back. If the response is 202, it's basically saying, I've completed the chunk, send me the next chunk. If you get 200 or 201, that means I've gotten the last chunk, we're all good. And so you need to make sure that when you walk through this process that you understand, again, how this works. This is a very specific scenario, but this is in the objectives. So they'll ask you how to do it. But again, if you read the online documentation, it walks you through the process, and the questions aren't really going to deviate from this much. All right, so next objective, extend and customize SharePoint. If you went to Bill Felker's session earlier about using the SharePoint framework, he covered a lot of this. The important thing is to know how to use the SharePoint framework to build a web part. But there's also a lot about SharePoint framework extensions. And these extensions are used for creating additions to a SharePoint page. You can also customize a list view, customize a field. But the other thing you're going to want to know to do is how to process and package an SPFX solution. And this has to do with understanding how that packaging process works. And it's a little bit different than an old school SharePoint app. So you want to know how that works. Oops. The next thing is understanding about how you're going to consume the Microsoft Graph from the SharePoint framework. Again, a little bit about third-party APIs, Azure AD from within the SharePoint framework that goes back to that identity platform. But then also you want to understand that you can use the SharePoint framework to build tabs in Teams. They're available in Teams. So you need to understand the relationship between that. And then finally, understanding about theming in SharePoint. This is a little bit different because they've now turned this into the Fluent UI. It used to be the Office Graph, what was it called? The Office, yeah, I'm blanking on what it was called. Anyhow, it's a Fluent UI now. So the questions may have changed a little bit for that. But in general, that's what's going to be tested for this. The main thing you want to know, first of all, is your tool chain. Node Package Manager is part of Node.js, and this is what you're going to do to be able to have the right constituent parts, the packages that are part of making your solution. Gulp is what you're going to use for serving up your solutions. It's a way of having a process server that is platform agnostic. And now the Yeoman generator is what's going to build what we call the scaffolding. So the Yeoman generator is created a tool that's built by the Microsoft team, where essentially they can go through and say, okay, you want to build a SharePoint web part. Which platform, which framework are you going to use? Is it going to be Knockout, Angular, React? What is it? And then you're going to go through, am I building a tab or am I building a web part? So it goes through this sort of questioning process, and based on how you answer, it's going to go through and actually build an entire sample project for you that you can use from the get-go. And so this is going to be your best friend in terms of creating that project. And then finally, Workbench is a way of being able to test your web parts on your local host. Because web parts depend on what's called a context, the page context, it's dependent on sort of SharePoint being wrapped around the web part. There may be times where you don't want to continually have to go deploy that essentially to your SharePoint Online environment. So that Workbench creates a fake, a faux, imitation SharePoint environment that can run in your local server, so you can test those web parts locally as you're building it. All right, so for packaging and deployment, you need to know the solution manifest XML schema and package solution.json manifest. So that solution.xml is what gives the actual package information about what parts are part of it, but then package solution.json is a different JSON formatted manifest file that within the solution files itself gives the project information about where the assets are. So those are sort of two different things, and you need to, things used to be done as XML for app packages in the past, so that's why it's still done that way, but this JSON manifest is more of a newer way of doing things, and so just understand how both of those work. You need to know how to create release builds, how to update a solution package. You need to know how to deploy assets to the Azure CDN. So it used to be when we had SharePoint hosted solutions, it deployed your assets to a SharePoint site. So if you had assets in the SharePoint site. Well, now these solutions don't necessarily have a site that they are getting deployed to, especially if they're extensions and things like that. So there's Office CDN, which it gets put in by default, but then you can use your own Azure CDN if you want, or any other CDN. And there are instructions about how to go about doing that. And then last but not least, understand tenant-wide deployment. Because again, there are a lot of scenarios where you don't want to deploy it to a site collection in particular. Let's put it this way. By default, you have to go into a site collection and say, I want to add an app. But rather than doing that, you can just go when you deploy it and say, I want to by default just deploy it to all my sites within my tenant. And again, this is especially important if maybe you're doing an extension. So the extension may be building a secondary navigation that shows up for your site. And in that case, you can deploy it tenant-wide. Understand how you can use SPFX in Teams. and you can surface your solution in a Teams tab, and understand how you can specify that within the Teams app manifest. And you're going to do that by using that supported hosts within that Teams app. All right, our next objective, extending Teams. We're going to talk about how you can, the components of a Teams app, and then specifically the exam will cover webhooks, tabs, messaging extension, and bots within the team, how to create those kind of Teams apps. So that's kind of a lot, and this is a lot of stuff that's the newest for people to understand how to use.
Hey, Becky, I think you're doing pretty good. You got about 15 minutes left.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Okay, so the App Studio is going to be your best friend. This just gives you a visual interface for editing the app manifest file underneath. So you could naturally, just like with SharePoint, you could directly edit the manifest, but this gives you a nice visual interface for managing that. So you want to be comfortable about how to use the App Studio within Teams. The next thing to understand are task modules. This is an extremely confusing terminology, extremely confusing. I don't know why it's called this, but basically a task module is like a floating form that can be used to gather input. So if we talked about the single page apps, we use pop-ups, it's the same idea. So in Teams, you may want to be able to say, if somebody wants to add a new tab, it could be that tab could be configurable, in which case you may say, when you add the tab, it may say, which project do you want to show information for? So the underlying code may be the same, but it's just going to show information for project 1 versus project 2. So if you want to gather information from users, you're going to do it via a task module. And the same for bots. If you've written a bot and the bot is asking input from a user to operate, it's going to use this task module. So you need to make sure you understand how to code the task modules, and those are two different scenarios, so understand how those work. Webhooks and connectors, understand that there's outgoing webhooks and incoming webhooks. So outgoing webhooks allows a user to just mention the webhook. And a webhook is a very lightweight way of adding something to a team. You don't have to deploy it as a package. It doesn't need to go to the whole organization. You can just add that webhook just to one team, and it's sort of a one and done kind of thing. And basically someone mentions it with the @ symbol and they can call the webhook. But it's not a part of a Teams app. An incoming webhook, it allows an external service to message your team. So for instance, I signed up for a webhook for MailChimp, and it gives me a weekly status update of how my newsletter is doing in terms of subscriptions and unsubscribing. So this is if you have sort of an automated operation. And the last thing you have is an Office 365 connector. And this is essentially when you're building an incoming webhook, an outgoing webhook, incoming webhook, not the outgoing. But essentially, you want to be able to package it up so that people can deploy it within their whole environment on a teams by team basis. It's less of an ad hoc kind of thing and more of that package solution. Again, for the exam, you need to know the difference between all of these because they're all related but different to one another. A messaging extension is basically if somebody is writing, there's several ways it can work. So an action command presents users with a dialogue to collect or display info. Essentially, usually this happens within that compose box. So in other words, you could say, I want to search for project information. It will go and it'll format it. You know, here's the name of the project manager, the details or whatever. So it allows people to do sort of a mini search operation, retrieve the information and post it in a nice sort of formatted way. The search command allows people to intercept queries in that search box at the top of the page. So for instance, if I search for if I type in my search term, project 123, and I have a search command action in there, a messaging extension, it may say, anytime someone uses the word project and a number, they're looking for one of our projects. So go retrieve that information and get it for them. So it sort of allows you to create highly customizable search operations, kind of like if someone's using a bot, it sort of intercepts it and says, hey, I know you're looking for something specific. And then link unfurling, like you say, sort of in that first scenario, it's like if you have ever embedded a link within an email message, it sort of grabs the first image it finds on the page and gives you the name of the web page and a synopsis. You can do those kind of things again, where you can basically say, if I recognize the URL, if the URL is pointing to mytenant.sharepoint.com/sites/projects, then they're probably looking for this one thing. I know what it is that they're trying to post in here. And so you can do that link unfurling. So you need to know how to code each of these solutions. All right, our last objective here is extending Office. And so for these, this is really talking about using Office add-ins. Now, specifically, you're going to want to know how to use the Office.js API. And this is specifically for Outlook, PowerPoint, and Excel. You also need to know how to package and deploy the add-ins. Okay, I just saw it here. Office UI Fabric, that's what the Fluent UI used to be called. So understand how to embed look and feel in there, and then understand how you can do testing, debug, and deployment within Office. The last thing you're going to want to understand are actionable messages, and these are specific, these are adaptive cards, but they're really used within Outlook. So again, if you've ever used like the Power Automate approval process, where you can have within Outlook a button that says approve, you sort of have that adaptive card within the Outlook environment where people can do an actionable message. So you need to know how that works as well. So in terms of the basics to extend Office, you can create an add-in command, and that goes in the ribbon at the top. You can have a dialogue, and that basically that oftentimes has to do with how you're embedding content within the body of your document. And then that task pane can do whatever you want. You can combine them. So in other words, the task pane may say, which information do you want to embed in your document? So that task pane could be nothing more than just retrieving information. So, you know, in Word, if you have like a dictionary, I want to look up a word, you could type it in, look it up, and maybe it doesn't go any further than that. But you could use the information from the task pane to embed content into your file. The core components of an add-in is the add-in manifest, the web application that defines the UI and functionality of add-in components. Remember that it has to be hosted somewhere. There is no web environment that task pane lives in, so you have to figure out, where am I going to host that task pane? For most people, it's within probably Azure, right? You need to know how to use the Office JavaScript API, and then you need to know API specific things for Excel, Word, and OneNote, or PowerPoint, I suppose. And then you need to know common features such as how to, you know, make a pop-up dialog, ask a question, have settings and things like that. And most of the APIs are pretty straightforward. If you're dealing with Excel, the API is going to be surrounding tables and cells, and with Word, it's going to be headings and paragraphs and things like that. So, but that being said, there are probably going to ask a couple questions on the exam about how do I reference a page in my Excel spreadsheet, and how do I highlight cells and things like that. There's really good documentation on docs.microsoft.com, so just take a look at that. All right, make sure you know how to publish, whether you use centralized deployment to push out to all users' apps, their Office apps from a central admin. Know how to sideload it when you're doing testing. Know how to deploy it from the SharePoint app catalog. App sources if you're publishing it for general consumption in the marketplace. And then specifically for Exchange Server, if you're dealing with these Outlook add-ins, and they can be deployed from on-prem or online and from a network share. This is an example of the actionable message I was talking about. You can actually take action when it shows up in your email. It's now Fluent UI. Just understand what the components are in general for React, and understand how you can build users' experiences with that. And then I'm going to go through a couple, you know, I think for the sake of time, we're almost out of time. So I will click through these so that you have them for the recording, but I don't really have time to look through them. So here is question 1. The answers for this are number 2 and 4. All right, for question 2, the correct answer is 1. For question 3, the correct answer is 3. And for question 4, you're going to use an Office 365 connector. All right, well, thank you very much for attending. I appreciate it. That is the end of my presentation, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks, Becky.
Take care.
Bye.